December 1967, Abbey Road Studios, Studio 2. The same room where the Beatles had recorded Sgt. Pepper's just months earlier. It was past 11 p.m., and the building should have been quiet, but the mixing desk was lit up, tape machines humming in the background. This wasn't supposed to be a recording session. It was supposed to be a meeting. George Martin sat behind the massive EMI console, adjusting his tie despite the late hour. At 41, he was already being called the fifth Beatle, the man who had shaped the sound of the most successful band in history. His reputation was built on precision, on understanding exactly how to capture lightning in a bottle, how to take raw musical ideas and transform them into sonic perfection. Across from him, Jimi Hendrix sat quietly in a folding chair, his white Stratocaster resting against the wall. He'd been in London for over a year now, and everyone knew his name. Are You Experienced had changed everything. But George Martin wasn't everyone. The meeting had been arranged by Chas Chandler, Jimmy's manager and former Animals bassist. Chandler thought it would be good for Jimmy to meet Martin, maybe learn something about the recording process. What Chandler didn't know was that Martin had his doubts about Jimi Hendrix. "I've heard your records," Martin said, not unkindly, but with the tone of a professor addressing a promising but unrefined student. "Impressive guitar work, very impressive, but there's a difference between playing live and understanding the studio." Jimmy said nothing. He rarely spoke in these industry meetings, preferring to let his guitar do the talking when the time came. But tonight there was no performance scheduled. This was just conversation. Martin continued, warming to his theme. "You see, the studio is an instrument in itself. It's not just about playing your guitar through an amplifier and hoping the microphones pick it up correctly. It's about understanding acoustics, microphone placement, tape compression, how different frequencies interact with each other." The engineer in the corner, Jeff Emerick, who had worked on many Beatles albums, nodded along. He'd seen dozens of rock musicians come through Abbey Road, convinced they understood recording, only to discover they were completely lost once they got behind the console. "Live performance is one skill set," Martin explained. "Studio work is entirely different. Most guitarists, even very good ones, they come in here and they're basically amateurs when it comes to the technical side. They play and they expect us to make it sound good." Jimmy shifted slightly in his chair, not defensively, but like someone who was genuinely listening, absorbing the information. This was George Martin, after all, the man who had recorded A Day in the Life, who had orchestrated Yesterday, who had figured out how to capture the controlled chaos of the Beatles' experimental period. "Take multi-tracking," Martin said. 8 tracks might seem like a lot, but knowing how to use them effectively, that's the art. Most rock musicians, they think more tracks means more opportunity to show off. "Could I try something?" Jimmy asked quietly. Martin looked surprised. It was the first time Jimmy had spoken in the 45 minutes they'd been talking. "Try something?" "With the 8-track, just to understand what you mean." Martin glanced at his watch. It was nearly midnight. The studio was booked solid during regular hours, but late-night sessions were common for established artists. He had nowhere to be tomorrow morning. "I suppose we could set up a quick demonstration," Martin said. "Jeff, can you patch in some mics?" Emerick nodded and began setting up microphones around a small amplifier. Standard procedure: one dynamic mic close to the speaker, one condenser a few feet back to capture room tone. Basic guitar recording setup that had been used on thousands of sessions. Jimmy stood up and picked up his Stratocaster, plugged it into the small Fender amp that Abbey Road kept in Studio 2 for exactly these situations. He strummed a few chords, checking the sound levels. "What would you like me to play?" Jimmy asked. "Whatever you'd like," Martin said, settling in behind the console. "The point is to show you how we capture the performance, how we shape the sound through the desk." Jimmy nodded and started tuning his guitar. The room fell quiet except for the soft hum of the tape machines and the gentle whir of the console's electronics. Then Jimmy began to play. But something was different. Instead of the explosive, feedback-heavy style that had made him famous, he played quietly, almost intimately. A simple chord progression, nothing flashy, but with a tone that seemed to fill the entire studio despite the low volume. "Interesting," Martin said, adjusting the faders. "You're getting a very clean sound. Most rock guitarists push their amps much harder." "Could I hear it back?" Jimi asked. Martin rewound the tape and played the 30 seconds Jimi had just recorded. It sounded good, professional, but nothing that would change anyone's understanding of studio recording. Now, Jimi said, could I try adding another track? Of course, that's the point of multi-tracking. But instead of playing a lead guitar part, as Martin expected, Jimi played something completely different. A bass line, finger-picked on his guitar's low strings, rhythmic and percussive. It wasn't trying to sound like a bass guitar. It was using the guitar to create bass frequencies in a way Martin had never heard before. How did you... Martin began, but Jimi was already asking for a third track. The third track was percussion. Jimi used his guitar as a drum, tapping the body with his fingertips, scratching the strings with his picks, creating rhythmic patterns that complemented the bass line perfectly. Martin watched, fascinated, as Jimi adjusted his hand position on the guitar body, finding spots that produced different tonal qualities. The high end of the guitar body gave sharp, snare-like sounds. The area near the bridge produced deeper, more resonant tones. It shouldn't have worked. Guitars weren't drums, but somehow it worked perfectly. Emmerich leaned over to Martin and whispered, "He's not just hitting it randomly. He's tuning the percussion to the key of the song." "Could I add one more layer?" Jimi asked, as if what he'd just done was perfectly normal. Martin, now genuinely curious and slightly unsettled by what he was witnessing, nodded slowly. The fourth track was melody, but played in a way that seemed to occupy a completely different frequency range from everything else. Jimi used the guitar's upper register, but not in the typical lead guitar style. Instead, he played single notes that rang out like bells, each one carefully placed to create space around the other elements. Martin realized that Jimi was thinking in 3 dimensions, understanding instinctively how different parts would sit in the stereo field, how they would complement and contrast with each other without competing for the same sonic space. George Martin found himself leaning forward over the console, studying the VU meters, watching how Jimi's approach was affecting the overall mix. The meters barely flickered, yet the sound filled the room completely. This wasn't random experimentation. This was someone who understood exactly how sound worked in recorded space, who could manipulate frequency ranges without ever using an equalizer, who could create dynamics without touching a fader. Martin glanced at Emmerich, who was staring at the console with an expression of professional bewilderment. In his years as an engineer, Emmerich had never seen anyone work this way. Most musicians needed guidance, needed the engineer to shape their sound. Jimi was essentially engineering his own recording through his playing technique alone. The studio clock read 12:47 a.m., but neither Martin nor Emmerich were thinking about the time. They were witnessing something that would change how they thought about their profession. "One more?" Jimi asked. By the 5th track, Martin realized he was witnessing something he'd never seen before. Jimi was building an entire orchestral arrangement using only his guitar, but each part was serving a specific function in the overall sonic picture. He wasn't just adding more guitar. He was adding texture, harmony, rhythm, melody, all as separate elements that work together like instruments in a classical arrangement. The 6th track was harmonics. Jimi played natural harmonics on different frets, creating bell-like tones that floated above the rest of the mix like strings in a symphony. By the 7th track, Jeff Emmerich had stopped what he was doing and was standing behind the console, watching Jimi play. He'd engineered hundreds of sessions, worked with the Beatles during their most experimental period, but he'd never seen anyone approach multi-tracking like this. For the 8th and final track, Jimi did something that made both Martin and Emmerich look at each other in confusion. He played the original chord progression again, exactly as he had on track 1. But somehow, in the context of everything else he'd built, it sounded completely different. It wasn't just rhythm guitar anymore. It was the foundation that held everything else together, the gravitational center that made all the other parts make sense. When Jimi finished, the studio fell completely silent except for the soft whir of tape machines and the distant hum of London traffic filtering through the building's thick walls. The red recording light remained on, casting an otherworldly glow across the mixing desk. Neither Martin nor Emmerich moved. They sat frozen in their chairs, processing what they had just witnessed. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before either man could speak. Martin stared at the console. 8 tracks, all recorded in about 20 minutes, and somehow they created a complete musical statement that sounded like it had been arranged by a full orchestra and performed by a 5-piece band. "Play it back," Emmerich whispered. Martin hit play. What came out of the studio monitors shouldn't have been possible. It was one guitar, recorded 8 times, but it sounded like a complete production. Every frequency range was filled, but nothing was muddy. Every rhythmic element was locked in, but nothing sounded mechanical. It had the complexity of a Beatles arrangement, but the raw emotional power of the blues. "How did you know to do that?" Martin asked quietly. "Know to do what?" Jimmy replied. "The frequency separation, the rhythmic interplay, the way each part sits in the stereo field. That's not something you learn from live performance." "I just listened," Jimmy said, "to how each part wanted to fit with the others." George Martin sat back in his chair. He'd spent years developing techniques for multi-track recording, working with the Beatles to push the boundaries of what was possible in the studio. He'd studied classical orchestration, understood how to voice harmonies, how to create space in a mix. And Jimmy had just demonstrated an intuitive understanding of those principles that Martin had never seen before. "You've never studied recording?" Martin asked. "No," Jimmy said simply. "Acoustic engineering? Music theory?" "No." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Martin stood up and walked over to the tape machine, rewound the 8-track master, and played it again. It was even more impressive the second time. Martin could hear details he'd missed before. The way Jimmy had used the natural compression of the tape to create sustain. How he'd positioned certain parts in the stereo field to create a sense of space that made the studio sound bigger than it actually was. "In 45 minutes, Martin said, more to himself than to Jimmy, "you've just demonstrated a more sophisticated understanding of multi-track recording than most professional musicians develop in years." Jimmy unplugged his guitar and leaned it against the wall. "Thank you for letting me try." That should have been the end of it. A late-night experiment, an interesting demonstration. But George Martin couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed. Over the next few weeks, he found himself calling other producers, engineers, musicians who had worked with Jimmy. What he heard surprised him. Jimmy wasn't just intuitive about recording, he was revolutionary. Eddie Kramer, who had engineered many of Jimmy's sessions, told Martin that Jimmy would often suggest microphone placements that shouldn't work but somehow did. That he understood how to use the studio itself as an instrument, manipulating acoustics, feedback, tape effects in ways that created entirely new sounds. "He doesn't think of the studio as a place where you capture performance," Kramer explained. "He thinks of it as a place where you create performance that couldn't exist anywhere else." 6 months later, Martin was asked to speak at a recording industry conference in London. The topic was innovation in studio techniques. Instead of talking about his work with the Beatles, he spent most of his time discussing what he'd learned from one 45-minute session with Jimi Hendrix. "I thought I understood multi-track recording," Martin told the audience of engineers and producers. "I thought my years of experience, my classical training, my work with the Beatles had given me mastery over the studio environment. Then I watched someone with no formal training, no technical education, create the most sophisticated 8-track arrangement I'd ever heard in real time by simply listening to how sounds wanted to interact with each other." Years later, after Jimmy's death in 1970, Martin was interviewed by Rolling Stone magazine about his experiences with various artists. When the interviewer asked about the most impressive display of musical ability he'd ever witnessed, Martin didn't hesitate. "September of 1970, Martin said. "Sorry, December 1967, Abbey Road. I watched Jimi Hendrix teach me things about my own profession that I didn't know were possible. He showed me that technical knowledge and musical intuition aren't separate things. In the right hands, they're the same thing." The interviewer asked what Martin had learned from that experience. "That the studio isn't something you master," Martin replied. "It's something you collaborate with." Jimmy understood that instinctively. He didn't try to control the recording process. He listened to it, responded to it, let it guide him towards sounds that served the music rather than his ego. "Did it change how you approach recording?" "Completely. After that night, I stopped trying to impose my technical knowledge on every session. I started listening more, controlling less. Some of my best work with the Beatles in their later period came from applying things I learned watching Jimmy that night. The story of that late-night session at Abbey Road became legendary among recording engineers, not because of what was recorded, but because of how it was recorded. The 8-track master still exists in EMI's vaults, a testament to the night Jimi Hendrix showed George Martin that the studio could be an instrument, not just a tool. George Martin called Jimmy an amateur in the studio. 4 hours later, he was asking Jimmy to teach him techniques he'd never considered. It's a reminder that mastery isn't always about formal training. Sometimes it's about listening so carefully to the world around you that you hear possibilities others miss. In the end, the greatest producer of his generation learned that night that there's always more to learn, always another way to approach familiar problems. Jimmy didn't just play guitar in the studio, he spoke its language fluently, without ever learning its grammar. That night at Abbey Road, the student became the teacher, and both men walked away better at their craft than they'd been when they arrived.